And welcome back. Now, the implementation of urgent economic and fiscal reform is needed to turn the country's economy around. South Africa's state-owned entities continue to be under scrutiny as they play a huge role and place a huge burden equally on the fiscus. Now, last week, Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan released a special paper on Eskom setting out the entity's road to recovery. Eskom, SAA, DENEL and Transnet are just some examples of the country's struggling SOEs in constant need of bailouts, prompting questions about whether these entities should be privatized. Now, Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan joins us now from our Pretoria Studios. Minister, good morning. Thanks for speaking to us and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to your viewers.
Minister, let's just start by taking a look at some of these examples: Eskom, SAA, DENEL, the ones under your portfolio, the state-owned entities, that is. What is your assessment of them at this point?
Well, when President Ramaphosa took over in February, March last year, what this administration and subsequently after the elections had inherited was a set of entities like the ones you've mentioned, but it also includes yourselves in SABC, PRASA, for example, that Minister Mbalula is looking at, entities that were operationally in difficulty, financially were dependent on the state and were not making enough money to cover their costs, and which had huge cost structures as well. Some of them have a direct impact on our people and on our economy, as you pointed out. So if PRASA doesn't work well, it impacts on commuters every single morning and evening and during the day. If Eskom doesn't work well, we have load shedding. If Transnet doesn't work well, goods and commodities don't get to our harbors for export purposes or within the country itself. And our port charges or freight charges may have a negative impact on the competitiveness of our economy as well. So where we are today is in the process of, if you like, recovery and stabilization. And the Eskom paper, for example, is a demonstration of our ability to actually say this is where we would like to take this organization and a very vital institution in our economy and in the lives of our people into the next 10 or 20 years. And start the process, which we have started already, of on the one hand stabilizing what we have under great difficulty, but also beginning to change the institution and the way it works, given the kind of technological and energy changes and carbon emission changes that are taking place across the world.
Now, Minister, speaking to that plan that you released last week, there was some criticism, and some of it dealt with the fact that some of the commentators felt that it was vague. Others felt that it lacked time frames which would be absolutely pivotal for making sure that this turnaround is indeed successful. How do you respond to that?
Well, then they haven't read the paper, because we've given them time frames at the end of the paper, because we're very aware that one of the first things our critics will say there's no time frame. So we've set a time frame for the separation of the transmission component. Much of it will be achieved by the end of the year, and the final process will be completed at the latest by the 31st of March next year. Secondly, we said that we will start looking at competition within the generating entities in Eskom itself. And thirdly, we must recognize that when we study examples elsewhere in the world, these transitions, as we might call them, in major utilities like the electricity utility can take anything between 10 and 20 years. So all we can do is to lay a solid platform operationally, financially, in governance terms, and in relation to the business model, which future generations will have to build on and continue to solidify whatever the new form is of the electricity utility as we go forward. So I think the country must get used to the idea of not just poking holes in what we have on the table, but rather saying, if there's something missing, let me contribute to it. Let me make the suggestions that we have to make, because we're open to suggestions, and become part of a team of South Africans, whether you belong to a trade union, a business organization, or you might be an energy expert of one kind or another. Become part of a South African team, like our rugby team was, and help build something that is going to last for many, many decades into the future.
Why do you think that, we are not pulling together when it comes to this, Minister? Because you mentioned the trade unions, for example. They've been very critical. They've been scathing of some of these mooted reforms. Why do you think we're unable to pull together here?
Because we don't share a common vision and a common understanding of the crises that we find ourselves in, firstly. Secondly, even amongst the people in the institution itself, I don't think we have the sense of urgency that's required to ensure, like you pointed out in your introductory remarks, that we stop depending on the state and the fiscus and the taxes of our people to run important entities like Transnet or Eskom or PRASA or whatever the case might be. This dependency mindset, which means that I can demand whatever I like, I can spend it in whatever way I like, is a mindset that we really have to get rid of. And part of the contribution both people in the institutions and outside can make is to recognize that these institutions are important for our economy and people. Secondly, that they have a major role to play in applying a greater sense of urgency and recognizing the crises that we face in many of these institutions. But thirdly, recognize that they could be part of a team that creates hope in South Africa and starts building things rather than be critical elements. But we will continue to engage with all of the stakeholders and make every possible effort to come onto the same page, because at the end of the day, we are confronted by changes that are also outside of our control. So international funders, local banks are no longer willing to fund coal-powered stations, for example. The current fleet that we have will last anything from 20 years to 50 years. After that, what happens? So we've got to prepare for that future as workers, as businesses, and as citizens as well, and be very mindful that carbon emissions are a major contribution to some of the climate change phenomena that we are confronted with. And each of us can actually make a contribution to reducing the damage to the environment as well.
So speaking of these international influences, Moody's, they changed South Africa's status from stable to negative until reforms are implemented. But we've also heard from all three these major ratings agencies that they actually do believe that government has the wherewithal to turn the situation around. But somehow we're still not getting there. Then you had economists coming out and they saying that what government is doing at the moment is tinkering around the edges instead of implementing real reforms. So to that end, Minister, do you believe that there is more that the government can do, and I mean realistically at this point, where you can show that you are really going in and changing these issues?
Well, our economy, Sakina, is 70% in the hands of the private sector, be they small businesses or large businesses. And they are the major employers in our economy as well. So we must recognize this balance of what are government's expectations or expectations of government and expectations of other role players. But secondly, if you're talking about reforms, the President has been leading this process for over a year now, and we have stability in the mining sector as far as the mining charter is concerned. We have some clear timelines subject to ICASA for the spectrum being released. We are committed to reducing administered prices. Minister Motsoaledi has started the process of introducing e-visas, both for tourism purposes, but for businesses as well. And so in each of our sectors, there are dynamic moves taking place. But at the end of the day, what matters for a ratings agency, and remember what they rate, is our willingness and ability to pay back the money that we've borrowed. So South Africa has an extremely good record in the democratic era of being both able to pay and willing to pay and have a high credibility. As Minister Mboweni mentioned a few weeks ago, they raised over $2 billion in the foreign markets without much difficulty. So South Africa is still very creditworthy in that regard. But the key is we need to grow the economy. The key is that we need to get investment in the economy. And the investment conference that takes place over the next 2 or 3 days is one where all of us should actually create the right kind of climate on the one hand, but a positivity about ourselves and a greater degree of hope which will begin to invite both South African investors and foreign investors to put money into our economy. Because if you grow the economy, all of these ratios begin to change. The tax to GDP ratio, the deficit, the debt to GDP ratio, all depend on the GDP. If the GDP is not 5 trillion but 6 trillion over the next year or year and a half, that means we've grown our economy, and then we will look much better. So I think government is doing its share. Government is open to, and I'm no government spokesperson, but as a member of the cabinet I can say we're open to collaboration and suggestions from all of the sectors of our society. But every one of us has to be part of that team that makes a contribution to making South Africa greater, better, more stable, and above all, growing in a way in which we create greater inclusivity and more jobs for our young people.
Now, speaking of debt, our SOEs, they're not looking great in terms of, their credit worthiness. The debt to GDP ratio, we heard the Minister of Finance talking about that going towards 70, the debt to GDP ratio. It's not looking good, Minister, and one of the things is Eskom. You pointed out last week during that press conference that Eskom, 450 billion rand in debt is 15% of our GDP. So what's going to happen with Eskom? How do you plan on tackling corruption to start with at Eskom? Because I think it doesn't matter what grand plans you put on the table, unless you are able to stymie the corruption, which you yourself have pointed out is systemic. How are you going to deal with the Eskom problem?
Well, we've made some progress under the board that was appointed in January last year in relation to some of the major figures that have been involved in corruption. But what's fascinating is that we seem to be into a period where the very people who've been guilty or alleged to have been involved in corruption and bringing these institutions to their knees are today committing what I would call economic sabotage and not allowing the processes of rebuilding these institutions, but rather interfering in these institutions. So that's number one. Number two,
could you elaborate on that, Minister? What do you mean by that?
Oh, you'll see all sorts of activity, and I don't want to go into specifics right now, but whether it is in Eskom or in Transnet or SAA or SA Express, corruption in the form of certain types of individuals and activities has been curtailed, but the efforts to undermine our plans to stabilize these institutions is always challenged in one form or another, whether in public narratives, through fake news, through interference within the institutions themselves. So in the case of Eskom, which you pointed out, the debt is the one thing, but the other is the cost structure of Eskom, which applies to others as well. So Minister Mantashe and ourselves have started a process of negotiations with the coal producers to basically say, can we come to a win-win arrangement in terms of the price at which coal is sold to Eskom? Remember that the whole Eskom enterprise over the last 70 or so years was premised on the fact that Eskom power stations will be built on coal mines, and coal will be transported through conveyor belts through the power stations. Now that whole system has been disrupted over the last 7 or 8 years, and it's a system that we've got to reintroduce in some way so that we get coal at a competitive price. Similarly, we are talking to the renewables industry and saying to them that rounds 1, 2 and 3, or bid windows 1, 2 and 3 are expensive and have been very expensive compared to the prices that are available today. Can we negotiate again a win-win arrangement that will enable us to reduce some of the costs that are coming through the first couple of windows and merge them with the more recent and much lower costs as well?
If I may just interject there, Minister, with regard to the cost of coal, Eskom obviously is paying too much for coal at the moment. And you speak of yourself and Minister Mantashe having to intervene in this regard. Why is it that those at Eskom who are tasked with procuring coal are not procuring at favorable rates for the utility?
Well, that's part of our history, isn't it? Over the last 7 or 8 years, that commandeering the supply of coal and trying to monopolize it in the form of Oak Bay and Optimum and Tegeta and so on, which is very much part of our history, and which the Gupta family and others were allegedly part of, was a way to actually make sure that certain mines will close, as happened in the case of the Arnott Power Station, and other mines will be, if you like, in a position where you have to buy coal from them. So the whole system of procurement, which is where much of the corruption actually takes place. A similar example would be the 1064 locomotives in the case of Transnet as well, where suddenly numbers jumped from 36 billion to 50 odd billion, and some 7 or 8 billion rands gets paid in Hong Kong to a company linked to Mr. Salim Issa for no services given to Transnet itself. So unwinding all of this, recovering some of this money, if not all of it, as we begin to track it down, making sure that the people who've been, as you correctly point out, involved in the malfeasance around coal and other forms of procurement suffer the consequences of what they've been actually doing, is all part of the tasks that we have as the law enforcement agencies come to into the focus and begin to do the things that they actually have to do. We, if in the paper, also indicate, by the way, that we might require an entirely different approach to purchasing coal and certain other expensive items that are required for turbine maintenance and other forms of maintenance in the plant as well. So over the next few months, we'll be looking into that, all with the endeavor to make sure that we save as much money as we can. And what we require is the cooperation of the tens of thousands of staff that work within these enterprises, because at the end of the day, if they want job security, whether it's in SAA, in Eskom, in Transnet, in DENEL, then they have to make an active contribution to getting rid of corruption and to stabilizing these entities and making some sacrifices as we go forward, so that all of us can come out in a 2 or 3 year period down the line with much more stable financial and operational institutions.
Well, we are out of time, Minister, but I have to ask you, last week one of the Eskom board members charged political interference in the work of the board at Eskom. Similar allegations have been levelled at SAA as well. Minister, are you interfering with the boards and the tasks that they have to perform?
No, that's absolutely not. And those are views that are not shared by the entire Eskom board, firstly. But secondly, that's a narrative that started in the context of what I've just told you earlier on, to make sure that we don't succeed in what we actually have to do. Interfering means going to a power plant and telling a power plant engineer, use this spanner instead of that spanner. I don't have the time for that. There's too many crises to actually deal with. So that is absolute nonsense. As government, when we, as Minister Mboweni pointed out, if you are putting money into these institutions to save jobs, but also to supply a service to South Africans, then we must make sure that the right things are happening in these institutions. And we will not be shy to actually do that. And it's people who have their fingers in the till who are in fact afraid of us being around as a department or even as ministers, because they will be discovered and their role in undermining these institutions will be exposed, as we will continue to expose them. So you're going to get all of these narratives, but remember, these are institutions that are almost half broken, that we are trying to piece together with board and management, and it is going to take a lot of negativity to actually stop us, but we owe it to South Africa to fix these institutions, to make sure that they are financially and operationally stable, and that we prepare the ground for the next 10 or 20 years into the future as far as these institutions are concerned. The
appointment of Nico Bezuidenhout at SAA, do you have anything to do with that?
No, that's the decision by the board of Mango.
And
so, I mean, you can throw as many of those questions, Sakina, as you like. So all these allegations are there. The relevant structures have actually responded to them. But, you know, if we want to get involved in the smear campaigns as opposed to rebuilding these institutions, then we must go ahead and do that. Those are all sideshows. What is more important? That SAA is able to make enough money to fly? Or should we, as some of my colleagues are saying in government, actually shut down these airlines because somebody else will come and actually run them? So those are choices that we as a country have to actually debate.
Absolutely. And on questions of clarity, Minister, as the public, we hear all of these things, we read about, as you call them, the sideshows, and we want clarity, we want answers, we want to know what's going on, which is why I'm putting the questions to you, because the allegation is that Nico Bezuidenhout, for example, came through as per your insistence, as opposed to Glenn Osmond, who was the board's preference for that particular position. And we know the history of Nico Bezuidenhout, the cloud under which he left. So that is why this is important, Minister. It's got nothing to do with any interest.
So let me clarify that, Sakina. Let me clarify that to the extent that I have all the facts. Those decisions, the advertisement took place by the Mango board. But Mango is a subsidiary of SAA as a whole. So under what we know as SAA is SAA the airline, Mango the airline, SAA Technical, which is in the news as well. So as you try to fix it and stop people stealing engine parts and so on, you get the reaction that you get in some media. So those are some of the subsidiaries, including Voyager and so on, of SAA as a group. SAA Technical, SAA and Mango have their own, let's call it subsidiary boards. The processes were run by those boards. And I was then informed that the main board was not involved in these particular processes, so they decided to go through the process again, and all of that has been outlined in the media. I've met Nico Bezuidenhout, I think twice maybe, many years ago. Why must I select Nico Bezuidenhout on top of anybody else? I don't know Mr. Osman. So the board has clarified their position that they have been the ones responsible. They decided to re-advertise and to make sure they get the right person in that position. So like that, there are many other instances where allegations can be made. But what's interesting, Sakina, is that the same questions are not asked about the previous chairperson of the SAA board or previous CEOs of the SAA airline that brought us where we are today. The same questions are not asked about people who've actually either enabled or themselves stolen billions of rands in Eskom or in Transnet. So when we are trying to fix things, now we have to explain ourselves. But that's fine. I think you're absolutely right. We need to account to the public. But that accounting has happened over many months now, and there's been statement after statement clarifying our position. But thank you for the opportunity for at least once again clarifying it again.
Minister, thanks for your time. Minister Pravin Gordhan there. And we are well into news time, so let's get into that with Leanne.